He walked out the way Tom Hanks always walks out, like the room had been waiting for him and was relieved he'd finally arrived. There's a quality to Tom Hanks that defies the usual vocabulary of celebrity. It's not magnetic in the way that word usually means, not dangerous, not unpredictable, not the kind of presence that makes you feel slightly off balance. It's something rarer and more difficult to manufacture, genuinely, constitutionally warm, the kind of warm that doesn't perform itself because it doesn't need to. He came through the late show curtain with that unhurried ease, that grin that somehow managed to be both entirely natural and entirely conscious. And 300 people responded the way they always responded to Tom Hanks, with the particular joy of people in the presence of someone who has never once let them down. He settled into the guest chair with the comfort of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and still found it interesting. At 68 he carried his age the way good wood carries its grain, visibly, honestly, beautifully. The silver hair, the slight thickening around the middle, the lines around his eyes that had been earned by decades of squinting at scripts and laughing at things that were genuinely funny. He looked like what he was, a man who had lived a full life and was paying close attention to every moment of it. Stephen greeted him warmly, the band played, and for the first several minutes everything moved in the comfortable, intelligent rhythm of two people who respected each other and enjoyed finding out where the conversation wanted to go. They talked about the new film, about the craft, about what it meant to still be finding things inside characters that surprised him after 4 decades of looking. Tom was generous and precise and entirely present, giving the conversation everything it asked for with that particular combination of intelligence and warmth that made everything feel both important and accessible. He was completely himself. And then Stephen set down his note cards. "Tom," he said, "I want to ask you about Philadelphia." Tom's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a small thing, the kind of thing most people in the room would miss, but Stephen was watching closely. "That's a long time ago," Tom said. 1993, Stephen said. 30 years, and in those 30 years I don't think anyone has ever asked you the right question about it. Tom looked at him. "What's the right question?" "Not about the preparation," Stephen said. "Not about the physical transformation or the research or the technical craft of it. Those have all been covered." He paused. "I want to know why that specific role, out of everything you've done, out of every character you've inhabited in 40 years, why Andrew Beckett stayed with you longer than any of them." Something happened in Tom's face, not a collapse, something more interior than that, a recognition, the expression of a man who has been asked the question he has been both dreading and waiting for. "How do you know he did?" Tom asked. "Because I watched the speech," Stephen said simply. "When you won the Oscar, you were supposed to be happy, you were accepting the highest award your industry gives, and you looked like a man who had just come back from somewhere very far away and wasn't entirely sure he'd made it back completely." Tom was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, he looked at Stephen, he looked at the desk between them as if he was measuring the distance. "Andrew Beckett was a man who was dying," Tom said finally, "and he knew it, and the people around him, some of them were retreating, not out of cruelty necessarily, out of fear, out of the specific human terror of proximity to mortality, of being near something that reminded them of their own fragility. And Andrew understood it. He could see it happening. He could see the people he loved creating distance, and he understood why they were doing it, and it didn't make the distance hurt any less." Stephen was very still. "I understood that," Tom said. "The understanding, not intellectually, not as an actor doing research, from somewhere else, from somewhere inside me that I had been," he stopped, "that I had been not looking at for a while." "What were you not looking at?" Stephen asked softly. Tom looked at him for a long moment. The question was precise, too precise to deflect with charm, which was his usual tool in these situations. "There was a period in my life," he said carefully, "before Philadelphia, during Philadelphia, when I was carrying something that I didn't have words for yet. Not an illness, not anything that dramatic, just a quality of loneliness that I couldn't explain to anyone around me because from the outside everything looked fine. Everything looked more than fine. The career was moving, the family was there, every external marker of a good life was in place." He paused. "And inside there was this specific kind of isolation. The isolation of not being able to say the true thing, of performing okayness while not being okay, of being surrounded by people who loved you and still feeling fundamentally unseen." The studio was very quiet. "Andrew Beckett knew that isolation," Tom said. "He lived it. He had built his whole professional life around being seen as one thing, and underneath that thing was another thing that he had hidden, not out of shame necessarily, but out of self-protection. out of the understood knowledge that the world he was operating in was not yet safe enough for all of him. And when the illness came and the hiding became impossible, he had to figure out how to exist in a world that was suddenly seeing things he had always kept private. He looked at his hands again. I didn't have to hide what Andrew hid, Tom said. I want to be clear about that. My situation was different in every specific. But the feeling, the specific texture of carrying something true about yourself that you have decided the world is not ready to receive, that I knew, that I recognized from the inside. And when I read the script and I encountered Andrew for the first time, something in me said, I know this man, not who he is, what he feels. I know what it feels like to be him. The first tear came then, quiet and present on Tom's face. The scenes that were hardest to film, Tom said, were not the ones you'd expect, not the courtroom scenes or the physical deterioration scenes or the final scenes in the hospital. The hardest ones were the quiet ones. The scenes where Andrew is with people who love him and he's receiving their love and he knows it's real and he's grateful for it and he's still alone. Still in that place that love can reach toward but can't quite touch, because the isolation wasn't about whether people loved him. It was about whether he had ever let himself be fully known. He stopped, the tears were present on both cheeks now. I filmed those scenes, Tom said, and I wasn't acting. Or I was acting, but I was acting from a place that was mine. That belonged to me, not to Andrew. The grief in those scenes, the specific grief of a man who is loved and still lonely, that came from somewhere real. And when the director said cut and everyone moved on to the next setup, I would sit there for a moment in the character's chair and I would think, I have been here, not in this exact situation, but in this feeling. I have lived in this feeling. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Stephen stood up from behind his desk without announcement and walked around to sit on the edge of it, facing Tom directly. He said nothing for a moment. He just moved closer, the way you do when someone is saying something that deserves proximity. Tom, he said finally, you just described something that I think is one of the most honest things an actor has ever said about their work. That the role didn't require you to find something from the outside and bring it in, it required you to find something from the inside that you hadn't fully acknowledged was there. Tom nodded slowly, the tears were still present on his face, he made no move to wipe them. The role gave me permission, Tom said. That's the thing I've never quite known how to say. Andrew Beckett gave me permission to feel something I had been managing not to feel, because in the context of the character, in the frame of the story, the feeling was legitimate. It was appropriate, it was safe to have, and in having it for Andrew I had it for myself. And in having it for myself, I started to understand that the thing I had been managing not to feel, the loneliness, the unseenness, the specific isolation of performing okayness, that it was not a sign of something wrong with me. It was just true. It was just part of what was happening inside a person who had built a very large public life and was still figuring out what it meant to also have a private one. Stephen looked at him. What happened after? Stephen asked. After the film, after the Oscar, did anything change? Tom considered this carefully, really thought about it in the way that showed. Yes, he said, slowly, not all at once, these things never happen all at once, but something had been named. By living inside Andrew's experience, I had given a name to something in my own experience, and named things are easier to work with than unnamed ones. They don't have the same power when you can call them what they are. He paused. I started having conversations I had been postponing with my wife, with people I trusted. I started being more willing to say the true thing even when the true thing was uncomfortable or inconvenient or didn't fit the image of someone whose life looked, from the outside, like it was working perfectly. Did it help? Stephen asked. Enormously, Tom said. Gradually and enormously. The way most real changes happen, slowly enough that you don't notice it while it's happening, and then you look back from somewhere further along and you realize the landscape has completely changed. He looked at Stephen with an expression that was complicated and grateful and still carrying the weight of what had just been said. I've never talked about this, Tom said. In 30 years of being asked about Philadelphia, I've talked about the research, the physical preparation, Jonathan Demme's extraordinary direction, the remarkable cast, the historical importance of the material. I've talked about all of it, and I've never said this, that the reason that film matters to me more than anything else I've made, the reason Andrew Beckett is still with me in a way that no other character has been, is that he gave me something. Not just the Oscar, something more important than the Oscar. He gave me permission to know myself a little better than I had before. Stephen looked out at the audience, then back at Tom. I want to say something, Stephen said. Not about the film, about you. The thing you just described, the experience of being surrounded by love and still feeling alone, of carrying something true about yourself that you haven't yet let the world receive, that's not a flaw. That's not evidence of something broken. That's the human condition in one of its most common and least talked about forms. And the fact that you found your way toward it through a character, through the specific grace of inhabiting someone else's truth in order to understand your own, he paused. That's not method acting, that's just a person learning to see themselves, through a very unusual and very beautiful mirror. Tom looked at him, both eyes were wet. Something in his expression had changed in the last hour, was still changing visibly in real time. The quality of the warmth was different, deeper, less performed, not because it had ever been insincere but because something underneath it had been given room. Andrew Beckett was a braver man than I am, Tom said. He didn't have a choice about being seen, the illness removed the choice. He was seen whether he was ready or not, and he faced that with a dignity that I found genuinely humbling. Every day on that set I thought, this man is showing me what courage looks like when the option to hide has been taken away. He paused. I had the option, I kept it for a long time, and what I learned from Andrew was that the option wasn't protecting me. It was just postponing me. He smiled then, small and fragile and entirely real, the smile of a man who has said the true thing and discovered that the world didn't end. He would have been a remarkable person to know, Tom said. Andrew Beckett, if he had been real, if the story had been different, I think he would have been one of those people who makes every room better just by being willing to be fully themselves in it. Like someone else I know, Stephen said quietly. Tom looked at him, the smile held. Walter would have liked Andrew, Tom said. They had the same quality, the same refusal to be diminished by what the world decided they were worth. The applause that followed was not the eruption of the opening that had been for Tom Hanks, the movie star. This was for something else. For the man who had carried Andrew Beckett's loneliness home from the set in 1993 and had finally, 30 years later, said out loud what it had really been. For the specific, irreplaceable courage of saying the true thing. Even when it takes 30 years to find the words. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered what it was for.